When my husband told me that if I couldn't trust him spending every weekend with his ex-wife, then maybe we shouldn't be together, the words didn't just echo in the living room. They carved into the air like a blade, slicing apart whatever thin layer of hope I still carried. He didn't shout. He didn't plead. He simply said it with the tone of a man closing a business deal, casual, certain, already resolved, and that coldness burned deeper than if he had screamed. I'm Anna, and I'm 28 years old, and I had been married for 4 years to a man I once believed was my partner, my safety, my forever. I sat at the kitchen table, the faint hum of the refrigerator buzzing behind me, the faint bitter scent of coffee overboiled on the stove, and in that ordinary, almost boring silence, my world was shifting. I lifted my eyes to his and forced a small smile, letting the words fall out. You're absolutely right, though inside me something fractured, a soundless crack spreading through my chest, the kind that once it begins, nothing can hold the structure together again. I lay awake that night while he slept beside me, his breathing even, heavy, as if nothing had been spoken, as if he had dropped a grenade into our lives and then drifted calmly into dreams. My body felt rigid against the sheets, my skin damp with sweat, though the air was cool, my throat aching from swallowing down words I would never say. I thought about my neighbor, Mrs. Jacobs, a silver-haired widow in her 70s who often knocked on my door with blueberry muffins or warm bread, her kindness a gentle reminder that someone noticed me. She once asked, in her soft, careful voice, why she never saw my husband on weekends. I had laughed, waving my hand, claiming overtime, travel, endless excuses, but I remembered the way her eyes had narrowed, sharp, with the kind of wisdom that comes only with age. She had known I was lying, and now, in the dark, her quiet suspicion seemed to echo louder than my husband's snores, and I felt a heavy shame pressing on my chest. My mind wandered to an office conversation just hours before the ultimatum. My colleague Jenna had leaned against my desk, confessing she didn't know how to handle the distance growing between her and her boyfriend, and then she said she admired how calm and patient I always seemed. She wanted to be like me. I had smiled, thanked her, told her that strength comes with time. But now, lying in that bed, the words felt like poison. My so-called strength was nothing more than endurance of loneliness. My calm, nothing more than fear of leaving. And I wanted to laugh and cry at the same time for how blind I had been, how easily I had convinced even myself that silence was a virtue. I thought of Christmas 2 years ago, when he told me he had to spend the evening helping his ex-wife with the children, promising it was nothing, promising he would be home late. I stayed behind, decorating a tree alone, listening to carols that only made the house feel emptier. Later that night, I scrolled through social media and saw a photo posted by a mutual friend. There he was, seated at her dinner table, raising a glass, smiling in a sweater I had bought him, surrounded by people who once had been my in-laws, as if he had stepped back into his old life without a second thought. I remember the sick taste in my mouth, the way I shut my laptop too quickly, pretending I hadn't seen, and then baked cookies I didn't eat just to keep my hands from trembling. That memory came flooding back in the darkness, sharper than ever, and I felt my chest constrict with the same hollow pain. Outside, the night was restless. A car alarm blared faintly down the street, then silence fell again, leaving only the ticking of the wall clock and the occasional shuffle of branches brushing against the window pane. I thought of the couple who had moved into the house across from ours, a young pair with a newborn baby whose cries sometimes pierced the still night, but always softened into coos and laughter, their joy spilling across the street like light. That very afternoon, I had watched them through the blinds, their holiday lights blinking merrily as they carried in bags of groceries together, and the contrast between their beginning and my ending stung so deeply, I felt my throat close. I imagined their future, birthdays, family photos, shared milestones, while mine was shrinking into excuses, ultimatums, and empty beds. At one point, I rose quietly, slipping my feet into slippers and pacing through the darkened house. My hands brushed against the cool surface of the dining table where so many untouched dinners had grown cold, and I could almost hear echoes of myself waiting for him, setting down plates, lighting candles, checking the clock until the wax melted down to stubs. I walked into the living room where a blanket still lay crumpled on the couch from the night before, the faint scent of his cologne clinging to it, and instead of comfort it made me feel suffocated, like I was wrapped in the fabric of a life that was no longer mine. When I finally crawled back into bed, I realized I wasn't afraid of his words anymore. I was afraid of wasting another year, another decade, playing the role of a wife who never got chosen first. I turned onto my side, my eyes fixed on the faint outline of his body in the dim light, and for the first time I didn't feel longing. I felt distance, a canyon stretching between us that no apology could cross. My heart pounded with fear, but also with something startling: clarity. By dawn, the light crept through the blinds, painting the walls in pale stripes, and with it came a strange calm. I realized I had stared at those same walls for 4 years, waiting for them to hold laughter, waiting for them to hold a family, but they had only absorbed silence and lies. He thought his ultimatum had trapped me, that I would either accept his weekends away or break under the weight of loneliness. But he was wrong. His ultimatum had freed me, and though my hands trembled, though my future was a blank canvas, both thrilling and terrifying, I knew I was finally standing at the doorway of my own life, ready to step through, ready to choose myself for the first time. I used to tell myself that love was patient, that marriage meant compromise, that sometimes we have to accept pieces of a partner's past if we want a future together, but the truth was that I had accepted not just pieces of his past, but the entire ghost of his former life, and I had built my world around a shadow I could never outshine. His ex-wife was always there, invisible yet present in every weekend, in every phone call taken just out of earshot, in every sudden errand that carried him away on Friday nights. At first, I convinced myself it was noble of him, this devotion to the children, this commitment to family ties. But slowly, I began to notice how the devotion stretched beyond what was reasonable, how laughter lingered in his voice when he spoke to her, how excuses piled higher than trust. I remember one Saturday afternoon when I was raking leaves in the yard, the crisp air biting my cheeks, the smell of damp earth clinging to my gloves. Our neighbor, Mr. Thompson, a retired teacher who often stopped by to chat, leaned against the fence and asked, almost casually, why my husband was never around on weekends. I said he was busy with work, but Mr. Thompson frowned, shaking his head with a knowing sigh, muttering that men who disappear too often are usually disappearing for reasons their wives don't want to admit. I laughed it off, pretending his words meant nothing, but that evening, when I found myself setting the dinner table alone yet again, I heard his voice in my head, and the sound of silence around me felt heavier than the entire world. Holidays were the hardest. There was the Thanksgiving when I roasted a turkey big enough for both of us, basting it carefully, setting out the good china, only to receive a last-minute text that he was helping his ex with the kids because they wanted to celebrate together. I ate my meal at the table alone, the ticking clock louder than any conversation could have been, and when Mrs. Jacobs knocked later that night with pumpkin pie, I lied through a forced smile, telling her we had eaten earlier at his parents' house. The pity in her eyes almost broke me more than his absence. The scent of sage stuffing clung to the kitchen long after, but instead of warmth, it reeked of abandonment. There were moments when I tried to fight back, to ask why he couldn't let go, to demand that he choose me fully, but he always had the same look, patient, patronizing, as if I were the one being unreasonable, as if my desire for a complete marriage was a flaw, not his double life. Once, in the middle of such a conversation, he said softly that I needed to be more understanding, that not every woman could handle the reality of a man with a past. His words wrapped around me like chains, and I remember thinking perhaps he was right. Perhaps I was weak for wanting him to be mine alone. That guilt became my cage, and I carried it for years, until the weight nearly crushed me. I recall another memory that haunts me still. His birthday 3 years ago. I spent hours baking his favorite chocolate cake, decorating the living room with balloons, inviting 2 of his friends to surprise him. He never showed up. He sent a text around midnight, claiming he had been stuck at his ex-wife's fixing a broken heater. And when I blew out the candles by myself, the wax dripping into the frosting, I felt like I was extinguishing the very light of my marriage. The taste of that cake was bitter, not from cocoa, but from betrayal disguised as duty. Looking back, I realize I had lived for years in the role of the outsider in my own home, the second choice in a love triangle where only one of us didn't know the rules. His shadow, or rather her shadow, loomed over every dinner, every celebration, every Sunday morning when I woke up to an empty bed. The sheets smelled of his cologne but carried no comfort, only the stale reminder of where he had been the night before. And yet, I stayed. I stayed because I feared the silence more than the absence, because I told myself that every marriage has struggles, that maybe with time he would drift back fully to me. But the truth was crueler. He never left her, not really, and I was too afraid to leave him. I swallowed my dignity, one small spoonful at a time, until I barely remembered what it felt like to be a woman who deserved more. It was only when he gave me that ultimatum, when he said maybe we shouldn't be together, that I realized the years of loneliness had already been training me for freedom. I had already been living without him, I just hadn't admitted it, and once the curtain was pulled back, once I saw the marriage for what it was, a performance where I was cast as the understudy in his life's play, the decision became inevitable. His shadow had defined my life for too long, but I was about to step out into the light, even if it blinded me at first. For months, my husband had been pushing me to agree to his transfer, a move that would place us in New York and uproot everything I had built in the quiet corner of my life. He insisted it was an opportunity, that it would open doors for him professionally, that we would finally live in a place with energy and ambition. Yet deep inside I knew that the city wasn't about us. It was about him chasing something he couldn't name. I resisted every time, saying my work was here, my friends were here, the life we had started was here, but each refusal left him colder, each no written across his face as proof that I was the obstacle between him and the future he thought he deserved. When he gave me his ultimatum, when he looked me in the eye and told me maybe we shouldn't be together, I saw not only the crack in our marriage, but the opening I needed. The papers he had begged me to sign sat in a folder on the desk, untouched, a silent battle between us. That morning, after a night of sleepless resolve, I walked into the study, my hands trembling as I lifted the pen, and for the first time in years I didn't hesitate. I signed my name, not as an act of surrender, but as a declaration that I was done fighting for a man who had already left me behind. The ink glistened under the lamp, dark and permanent, and as I placed the pen down, I felt a strange calm wash over me, as though I had finally broken free from invisible chains. The decision wasn't entirely impulsive. What he never knew was that months earlier, I had quietly spoken with my colleague Jenna's cousin, who worked at a firm in New York and had been offered a position myself. I had tucked the email away, too afraid to imagine the possibility, but now it felt as if fate had been waiting for me to find the courage. He thought the transfer was his triumph, his path forward, but in truth, it was mine, a secret door that had been left ajar. The irony made my lips curve into a smile that morning, one he would never see, because while he believed I was bending to his will, I was carving my escape route right under his nose. I remember the moment I placed the signed papers on the desk and stepped back, the silence of the room wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. Outside the window, the world was waking, the sound of children shouting as they ran to catch the school bus, the bark of a dog echoing down the street, the crisp wind rattling the bare branches. Life was moving forward all around me, while for years I had been frozen, waiting for him to notice me, to choose me, to see me. Now, with one signature, I had chosen myself, and the sound of the school bus pulling away felt almost like a victory march. Later that day, Mrs. Jacobs knocked on my door with a basket of fresh bread, her eyes twinkling as she asked if I was all right. I wanted to tell her everything, to spill the secret burning inside me, but instead I smiled, thanked her, and tucked the bread into the kitchen counter. Still, when I closed the door, I pressed my forehead against the wood and whispered softly to myself that soon Very soon, I would be gone. I imagined the look on her face when she would realize I had left, and strangely I felt comforted, as if the quiet acknowledgement of someone who cared, however small, would carry me into the unknown. As evening fell, my husband returned home, his tie loosened, his face weary, and he barely noticed the folder on the desk. He kissed me on the cheek absently, the scent of his cologne sharp against my skin, and retreated into the kitchen to pour himself a drink. I watched him from the hallway, the way he carried himself like a man certain of control, and I almost laughed at the secret I held in my heart. He had no idea that the game he thought he was winning had already ended, no idea that the walls he believed kept me bound were crumbling around him. I cooked dinner as usual, the sound of sizzling oil filling the kitchen, the smell of garlic and onions rising, but every movement felt different, lighter, almost defiant. When he asked me absent-mindedly about my day, I answered with a soft smile, offering nothing, while inside I was bursting with the knowledge that my life was no longer his to dictate. He ate quickly, his phone buzzing with messages he tried to hide, and I let him, because soon his secrets would no longer be my burden. That night, as he drifted into sleep, I lay beside him with my eyes open, staring at the faint outline of the signed papers resting on the desk in the other room. My heart beat steadily, not with fear, but with anticipation. For years I had lived in the shadows of his choices, accepting scraps of affection, hoping for change. But now the choice was mine, the future was mine, and with every breath I took, I felt myself stepping closer to freedom. He thought the transfer was his victory, but it was my rebirth, and soon he would understand that the life he tried to control had slipped completely out of his grasp. The morning I left began with silence so profound that it felt alive, pressing against my skin, heavy in my chest, almost as though the house itself knew that everything was about to change. I woke before dawn, the faint bluish glow of the early sky stretching like veins across the ceiling, and for a long moment I lay still, listening to the steady rhythm of my husband's breathing. He was turned on his side, back toward me, shoulders slack, lips parted slightly, resting in a peace that had been denied to me for years. It struck me with bitter irony that he could sleep so soundly while I lay awake night after night, drowning in questions he never answered. I eased myself from the bed, my heart hammering as if I were committing a crime, though in truth I was finally setting myself free. I walked barefoot across the cold floor, each step careful, deliberate, as though even the creak of the wooden planks might betray me. In the dim light of the hallway, shadows stretched long and thin, and I felt as if I were moving through a tunnel of memories, each one whispering warnings, each one urging me forward. I reached the closet, fingers trembling as I pulled out the small suitcase I had hidden behind old coats. The zipper rasped harshly in the stillness, a sound that seemed too loud, too daring, and I froze, glancing back toward the bedroom. His breathing never changed. Relief washed through me, but it carried with it a sharp edge of fury. He had slept through so much of our marriage, and he was sleeping now as I walked away. I packed with quiet precision, folding shirts, sweaters, dresses, sliding them into the suitcase not with sorrow, but with the determination of someone layering armor piece by piece. The smell of detergent clung to the fabric, mingling with the faint perfume that still lingered from nights when I had dressed up only to eat dinner alone. Every garment seemed to carry a memory, some painful, some empty, none worth holding on to, and yet as I placed them neatly inside, I felt strangely powerful, as if reclaiming them for myself was an act of rebellion. On the kitchen table, I laid down a single white envelope, unremarkable in appearance but heavy with the truths I had collected over years. Inside were receipts from hotel stays, restaurant bills, screenshots of late-night messages, and even a photo I had found by accident one Christmas, of him laughing with his ex-wife, his arm around her shoulders, his smile bright in a way it had never been with me. I didn't write a letter, didn't scrawl explanations or pleadings, because explanations were for people who still sought understanding. What I wanted was the silence of discovery, the sting of undeniable evidence, the hollow echo in his chest when he realized the woman he thought naive had seen it all and chosen not to fight but to walk away. I thought back to the night in the garage, the smell of gasoline thick in the air, when I had overheard him whispering into his phone. His voice had been soft, intimate, the kind of voice he hadn't used with me in years, and he had said words that seared into me. "Don't worry, she'll never leave. She depends on me too much." I had stood there, my hands icy, my breath shallow, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead like a cruel witness. I hadn't confronted him then. I had swallowed the pain, carried it into the house like a sickness. But now, as I brushed my fingertips across the envelope, the memory felt different. It no longer hurt. It fueled me. As I glanced around the living room, I realized it was already a museum of lies. The blanket on the couch still smelled faintly of his cologne, but instead of comfort, it reeked of absence. The magazines stacked neatly on the table, the framed photographs on the wall showing smiling faces on vacations where I had smiled only for the camera. All of it looked staged, hollow, a performance I could finally walk out of. I thought of friends who had complimented us, who had said what a beautiful couple we made, and I wanted to laugh at the irony. They had envied a picture, not a marriage. Fear flickered through me as I reached the door, my hand trembling on the cool metal of the knob. A whisper of doubt rose. Was I really strong enough to step into the unknown, to abandon the familiar, even if it was poisoned? My body remembered every lonely dinner, every holiday spent in silence, every moment of waiting for footsteps that never came, and the weight of those memories crushed the doubt into dust. The fear was still there, but it no longer ruled me. When I opened the door, the morning air rushed against me, crisp and sharp, smelling faintly of wet grass and chimney smoke from houses waking slowly to their routines. The world seemed to pause, holding its breath with me, as if it too knew the importance of the step I was taking. I closed the door behind me softly, resisting the urge to slam it, though a part of me longed for the echo, for the jolt that would tear him from sleep and force him into awareness. But no, the silence was more powerful. My absence would scream louder than any argument could. As I wheeled the suitcase down the driveway, its small wheels crunching against the gravel, I felt the strangest lightness. My chest lifted, my shoulders uncurled, and though my heart raced with fear, I felt a flicker of joy, the kind that comes when you finally stop waiting to be chosen and choose yourself instead. I thought of Mrs. Jacobs next door, her curtains drawn, her porch light glowing faintly. She would wake later, see my car gone, and though she might worry at first, I imagined her soft smile, the kind of smile women who have lived long lives give when they recognize another woman has finally broken free. Halfway down the street, I paused, hand tightening on the handle of the suitcase. For a brief, dizzy moment, I thought I heard his voice, not in reality, but in my mind, calling me back, questioning me, scolding me. I almost turned, almost looked back, but then a sound broke the illusion, the call of a bird perched on the lamppost, its song crisp and startling in the quiet dawn. It was as if the world itself reminded me to keep walking. I drew in a breath, tasting the cold morning air, and moved on. Sliding the suitcase into the trunk of my car, I glanced once more at the house, the blinds still shut, the walls still holding the man who believed he owned me. There was no sorrow in my chest, only release, only the strange sweetness of justice that came not from confrontation, but from disappearance. He would wake to find the bed empty, the envelope on the table, the truth laid bare, and the woman he underestimated gone. As I sat behind the wheel, the engine rumbling beneath me, I imagined his face when he opened the envelope. At first denial, then confusion, then rage. He would look around the empty house, perhaps calling my name, perhaps laughing in disbelief, thinking I had gone for a walk, that I would be back. But then he would see the suitcase missing, the silence stretching, and the truth would settle on him like a weight he could not escape. That was my revenge, not screaming, not breaking dishes, not begging him to see my worth, but leaving so completely that he could never touch me again. I thought of Jenna, my colleague, of how she had once told me I seemed strong. I wished she could see me now, not the woman who smiled through loneliness, but the woman who was driving away from it. I thought of Mr. Thompson's words at the fence, his warning about men who disappear too often, and I wished I had listened sooner. And I thought of Mrs. Jacobs, with her blueberry muffins and her gentle eyes, and hoped she would know, in her bones, that I had finally chosen my own freedom. By the time I turned the corner, the sun had broken fully over the horizon, washing the street in pale gold. My heart still thudded with fear, but fear no longer felt like a chain. It felt like a current, carrying me forward, pulling me away from the wreckage of a life I could no longer inhabit. The silence of my departure was not just absence, it was justice, it was truth, it was rebirth. And as I pressed my foot on the gas, the car moving steadily into the unknown, I whispered to myself that the woman who left this morning was not the same woman who had lain awake in that bed the night before. She was stronger, sharper, and free. I drove through the still sleeping streets with my suitcase in the trunk and my heart pounding like a second engine inside my chest, the steering wheel slick under my palms, not from the morning dew, but from the sweat of anticipation. Every stoplight seemed to hold me longer than usual. Every shadow stretched across the road like a test of my courage. Yet with each mile that separated me from the house I had called home, I felt the chains loosening, link by link. In the passenger seat beside me lay the printed boarding pass, edges slightly curled from the heat of my hands, and I glanced at it as if it were not just a piece of paper, but a declaration of war, because what he thought I had signed for him was in truth the beginning of my own escape. He believed I had finally surrendered to his vision of London, to a life orbiting around his career, a city he painted as sophisticated and inevitable, a place where his name would matter more than it ever had here. But the cruel satisfaction that burned inside me came from knowing that while he imagined me moving to London in reluctant obedience, I was instead heading in the opposite direction, to New York, a city that was mine, a city where I had planted a quiet seed months ago and now was ready to let it grow. I savored the thought of his shock when he discovered the truth, his arrogance dissolving into confusion, and the idea made my hands steadier on the wheel. The drive to the airport felt almost unreal, the sky shifting from pale blue to soft rose as the sun climbed higher, and with every streak of light across the horizon, I felt more awake than I had in years. The hum of the engine became a song of liberation. The scent of gasoline at the pump, where I briefly stopped, seemed sharper, fresher, as if even the air understood I was no longer breathing the same life. When I stepped inside the terminal, the sound of rolling suitcases, voices echoing, the faint tang of coffee and disinfectant in the air, all blended into a symphony that felt like freedom. I moved quickly through the crowd, keeping my head down, afraid that at any moment someone would tap me on the shoulder and tell me to go back, to remind me of my duties as wife, but no one did. Instead, I stood in line for security with strangers whose stories I didn't know, and for the first time in years I felt anonymous, invisible in the best way. The weight of his expectations had always made me feel watched, judged, but here in this bustling anonymity, I was just a woman with a suitcase and a ticket, nothing more, nothing less, and that felt like power. When I reached the gate, I sat near the window, the glass cool against my palm as I leaned forward, watching the plane's taxi slowly across the runway. Children squealed as their parents handed them snacks. Businessmen tapped furiously on laptops. An elderly couple held hands as they dozed, and in that quiet observation, I felt something open inside me, a recognition that I was no longer tethered to his narrative. I could choose my own seat, my own path, my own horizon. The irony was rich. He thought he had finally gotten me to bend to his will, but in truth, he had pushed me straight into the arms of my independence. Just before boarding, my phone buzzed with a message, his name flashing across the screen, and for a moment my breath caught in my throat. He had written only a single line. "What are you doing this weekend?" My lips curled into a smile, sharp and secret, because while he imagined me waiting for him at home, I was steps away from disappearing into the sky. I didn't answer right away. I wanted the silence to linger, to swell, to grow into panic in his chest before I sent the picture that would upend his certainty. When the boarding call came, my legs trembled as I rose, but it wasn't fear, it was exhilaration. The carpet beneath my shoes felt springy, almost urging me forward, and as I handed over the ticket, the scanner beeped with a sound so ordinary yet so monumental it felt like a bell ringing for freedom. The flight attendant's smile was polite, but in my mind it was conspiratorial, as though she too knew I was running not just toward a city, but toward a life that was mine alone. I slid into my seat, fastening the belt with fingers that tingled from nerves, and as the engines roared, the vibration shook something loose inside me, something I had held for too long. The belief that I needed him. Watching the ground fall away, the houses shrinking into toy blocks, the streets into thin lines, I felt as though I were watching my old self vanish beneath the clouds, small and powerless, left behind forever. Hours later, when the wheels touched down on the runway at JFK, the jolt sent a thrill through me that no words could capture. The announcement crackled overhead, the cabin buzzed with people stretching and gathering their bags, and I sat perfectly still, savoring the knowledge that when he checked the transfer file expecting me to be in London, he would find nothing. Instead, I was here, in a city that owed him nothing and offered me everything. The terminal smelled of coffee, pretzels, and the faint metallic tang of machinery, and each scent felt sharper, more alive than anything I had known back home. I walked slowly through the crowd, suitcase wheels rattling, and each step felt like a drumbeat of defiance. I pulled out my phone, my thumb hovering over his message once more, and with a calm smile, I lifted the camera, snapping a selfie with the sign, "Welcome to New York," glowing behind me. I hit send. The message whooshed away, and I imagined the moment it landed in his palm, the widening of his eyes, the confusion turning to anger, the sickening realization that he had never been the master of the story, only a character I had outgrown. That image alone was worth more than every apology I had begged for, every promise he had broken. As I stepped outside into the sharp chill of New York air, taxis honking, voices shouting, steam rising from subway grates, I felt the city embrace me in its chaos. It didn't care about my past, didn't measure me against another woman, didn't chain me to memories I never chose. It simply existed, wild and alive. And now, so did I. I raised my hand for a cab, the yellow blur pulling up beside me, the driver nodding as he asked where I was headed, and for the first time in years, I answered without hesitation, without apology, without looking back. I gave him the address of the small apartment waiting for me, a place no one knew but me, and as we drove away, the city lights flickered across the windshield like stars falling into my lap. And there, as the city swallowed me whole, I whispered softly to myself that the greatest twist of all was not the flight, not the city, not even the envelope on the table. The greatest twist was that he thought his ultimatum had cornered me into despair, but it had in fact handed me the wings I needed. I had left quietly, but the echo of my departure would roar in his life long after he realized he had lost me forever. New York greeted me with a mixture of chaos and indifference, the noise of honking taxis, the scent of roasted chestnuts drifting from a street cart, the sharp chill of wind funneling between tall buildings, and it all felt strangely comforting, because unlike the life I had left, this city demanded nothing of me. It did not compare me to anyone. It did not weigh me down with expectations or shadows of past wives. It simply pulsed forward, uncaring and alive. As I dragged my suitcase along cracked sidewalks, the wheels rattling against uneven pavement, I realized that the anonymity was my greatest gift, because here no one knew the woman who had been second best. Here I was just another face in a river of strangers, and in that freedom I felt my spine straighten, as though I were taller, lighter, and finally in possession of myself. The small apartment I had rented sight unseen was nothing grand, a narrow space with peeling paint, squeaky floors, and a window that looked out over a row of rusting fire escapes. But when I set my bag down and closed the door behind me, the air inside felt sacred, because it was mine alone. I ran my hands along the chipped counter, pressed my cheek to the cool glass of the window, inhaled the faint scent of fresh paint from a neighbor's renovation, and with each detail, I felt a quiet joy that no mansion could have given me, for it was not beauty that mattered, but ownership of my choices. That night, lying on a mattress on the floor with only a blanket I had packed from home, the city's hum drifting through the walls, I felt more peace than I had in the king-sized bed beside a man who had never really been mine. The next morning, as I stood in line at a crowded coffee shop, the chatter of voices mixing with the hiss of steaming milk and the clatter of cups, I overheard a group of women laughing about their weekend plans, their words spilling out with ease, and I realized with a pang how long it had been since I had laughed without effort. The barista, a young man with tired eyes but a kind smile, handed me my drink and said welcome to the neighborhood, and though it was such a small phrase, it lodged in me like a seed, because it reminded me that beginnings often hide in ordinary moments. As I walked out, the cup warm in my hands, I whispered a silent promise to myself that I would learn to laugh again, that this city would not just be an escape, but a rebirth. And yet, even in that fragile peace, the past reached for me, because that evening, walking down a crowded street lined with glowing shop windows, I stopped in shock when I caught sight of a familiar figure. It was his ex-wife, the very woman who had haunted my marriage, standing at the curb waiting for a cab, her scarf pulled tight against the wind, her expression tired but determined. For a moment I thought my eyes had betrayed me, but then she turned, and recognition cut through me like lightning. The city that promised freedom had instead delivered me face to face with the ghost I thought I had outrun, and as her eyes met mine, a chill crawled down my spine, because I realized New York would not just be the stage for my new life, it would be the place where hidden truths came to light. I couldn't shake the image of her face, the unexpected encounter on a crowded New York street where I had hoped to vanish into anonymity, and the thought of her walking the same avenues unsettled me more than I wanted to admit, because it confirmed that the web my husband had spun reached further than I ever imagined. That night in my apartment, the hum of traffic seeping through thin walls, I sat on the floor with my knees pulled close and my phone clutched tightly in my hand, wondering if he had already realized I was gone. If he had found the envelope, if his arrogance had finally cracked into panic. The silence of my notifications mocked me until, suddenly, the screen lit up with his name, and my pulse jumped so sharply I nearly dropped the phone. The message was short, almost casual. "What are you doing this weekend?" As if nothing had happened, as if I were still at home waiting for him to return from yet another visit with his past. My lips curved into a bitter smile, because I could picture him sending it with the confidence of a man who believed he still held the leash, unaware that the woman he dismissed had slipped from his grasp completely. For a long moment, I stared at the words, feeling both fury and triumph course through me. Then with a deliberate calm, I raised my phone, snapped a selfie against the glowing sign that read, "Welcome to New York," and pressed send. The whoosh of the message felt like thunder, though the room around me remained silent. I imagined him in that instant, phone in hand, expecting perhaps a sigh, a plea, maybe even a question about dinner, but instead receiving proof that I was no longer his to control. I pictured the confusion flashing across his face, the disbelief, the quick calculation of how and when I had managed to turn his game against him, and I savored the thought like a sip of strong wine, burning and sweet at once. Yet my satisfaction was cut with unease, because only hours before I had seen the woman who had stood between us for years, and the coincidence was too sharp to ignore. What if their connection was not just about old routines? What if he had orchestrated more than I knew? What if my move into freedom was walking me straight into a deeper trap? That night I slept restlessly, the city's noises both comforting and haunting, sirens wailing distantly, voices drifting up from the street, the radiator clanking like a heartbeat out of rhythm. Each sound felt amplified against my thoughts, because though I had delivered him a wound with that photograph, I could not shake the sense that his reply, or worse, his silence, would carry consequences. My revenge had begun in quiet defiance, but in the glow of the phone screen, I realized it was no longer just a departure. It was a declaration, and men like him rarely surrendered without striking back. The morning after I sent that photo, I woke with a strange heaviness, as though the air in my small apartment carried more weight than oxygen, pressing against my chest and warning me that freedom, as sweet as it was, never came without consequence. I made coffee in the chipped mug left behind by the previous tenant, its bitter steam filling the narrow room, and while I waited for the phone to light up again, my thoughts drifted to the chance encounter with his ex-wife. The image of her scarf whipping in the cold wind, her sharp eyes locking with mine, haunted me because it confirmed what I had long suspected but never allowed myself to admit. She was not simply part of his past. She was still an active character in the story he had been writing behind my back. Later that afternoon, as I unpacked the last of my things, I stumbled upon an old folder I had slipped into my bag almost without thinking, a folder I had once hidden at the back of a drawer to avoid the torment of its contents. Inside were documents I had collected in silence, unexplained charges on joint accounts, credit card statements showing withdrawals I never made, even bank slips where my name appeared alongside signatures I knew were not mine. My hands shook as I spread them across the floor, the paper cool against my fingertips, and suddenly the reality crystallized in brutal clarity. He hadn't only been lying to me emotionally, he had been using me financially, building his secret life on the very foundation of my trust. The realization stung deeper than any betrayal of the heart, because love, however fragile, can forgive weakness, but theft of identity and dignity is a wound carved into the bone. I thought back to small moments I had ignored, the time he brushed off my question about a strange withdrawal, the way he insisted on handling all the bills himself, the night I caught him shredding papers in the garage under the harsh fluorescent light. Back then, I told myself it was stress, ordinary mistakes, harmless secrecy. But now the pattern was clear, and I felt both rage and relief wash through me in equal measure. Rage for the years he had stolen from me, relief that I had finally stepped away before he could destroy me entirely. As night fell, I sat on the floor surrounded by papers like the wreckage of a storm, the city's glow casting shifting patterns across the room, and I realized this wasn't only a story of leaving a marriage, it was the unearthing of a crime hidden in plain sight. He had underestimated me, believing my silence meant ignorance, but silence is not blindness, and the truth, now laid bare in my hands, felt like a weapon I had been sharpening without even knowing. I whispered into the empty room that this was no longer about heartbreak, it was about justice, and though fear still coiled in my stomach, it twisted now into determination, because if he thought I was walking away quietly, he had not yet understood the kind of strength that grows from betrayal. In the days that followed, I began to carve out a life in New York that felt both terrifyingly fragile and fiercely mine, as though I were walking barefoot across broken glass, yet refusing to turn back, because every cut reminded me I was moving forward. I furnished the apartment slowly. A second-hand table bought from a neighbor down the hall, mismatched chairs hauled up 6 flights of stairs, a lamp that flickered when the wind rattled the old windows. But to me, these imperfect pieces were symbols of freedom, far more valuable than the polished furniture I had left behind in that house of lies. At night, I would sit by the window with the hum of the city below, headlights streaking like restless stars, and though loneliness sometimes pressed against me, it was a loneliness of choice, a silence that belonged to me alone. I reached out to Jenna's cousin, the woman who had once offered me an opportunity in the city, and when we met in a quiet cafe near the office, her warm handshake and the confidence in her eyes felt like a lifeline thrown across stormy waters. She spoke of the position with a mixture of practicality and encouragement, reminding me that a new career was not just survival but reinvention. And as I listened, I realized how long it had been since someone had spoken to me without condescension, without reminding me of my shortcomings. Walking out of that cafe into the crisp air, the cup of coffee still warming my hand, I felt the weight of possibility pressing on me in a way that did not suffocate but lifted, as if the city itself were whispering that I had been right to come. Yet the past was never far, tugging at me through the screen of my phone, because while I threw myself into building a new routine, I couldn't ignore the flurry of messages from him, some dripping with rage, others cloaked in false tenderness, alternating between threats and pleas, as if he couldn't decide whether to punish me or lure me back. Each notification made my chest tighten, but instead of replying, I saved every word, archiving his contradictions, because they were proof not only of his unraveling, but of my strength. The woman who once answered every call, who once softened at every excuse, now sat with steady hands, watching his desperation grow. And though fear still lingered in my veins, it was tempered with a fire that no longer allowed me to bend. One evening, as I walked home from the office through streets glittering with the glow of shop windows, I passed by a group of women laughing loudly, their arms linked, their joy spilling into the night air like music, and I felt tears sting my eyes, not from sadness, but from recognition. I wasn't there yet, not ready to laugh so freely, not ready to let joy erupt without warning, but I knew I was walking toward it, step by step. I whispered to myself that my beginning had already arrived, not in sudden fireworks, but in quiet choices: a rented apartment, a signed job contract, a refusal to answer a toxic message. My revenge was no longer about his destruction, but about my rebirth. And as the city swallowed my footsteps, I felt for the first time that my life was unfolding, not as a reaction to him, but as a story finally written by me. News of his unraveling reached me not through him, but through whispers that traveled faster than his pride could contain. A former colleague of his, a man I met by chance at a networking event, mentioned offhand that the long-anticipated transfer to London had collapsed, that the board had withdrawn their support after financial inconsistencies were discovered in his accounts. I listened quietly, my coffee cooling in my hand, while inside me a slow burn of vindication spread, because I knew exactly what those inconsistencies were, the same documents that lay folded in my drawer, the same evidence of fraud and deceit he had woven around my name. He thought I would carry his sins in silence, but silence had teeth, and the damage he caused finally circled back to devour him. In the weeks that followed, his messages grew more frantic, a mixture of apologies so syrupy they dripped with desperation and threats so hollow they echoed like a man shouting into a canyon. He spoke of mistakes, of second chances, of how I had misunderstood everything, and each word only confirmed the truth. He was not sorry for what he had done, only sorry that I had escaped before he could finish what he started. I no longer answered, no longer fed the cycle of lies and guilt, but I saved everything because evidence has a way of becoming both shield and sword. And though I did not plan revenge in the traditional sense, I knew that every file, every word, every fragment of his unraveling was a fortress I could stand behind. Meanwhile, my own life stretched and grew in ways I had not thought possible. I settled into my job with a quiet pride, learning to walk into rooms without apology, to sign my name without hesitation, to make decisions that carried my own weight instead of his. I made new friends, colleagues who invited me to late dinners where laughter spilled over wine glasses, neighbors who knocked on my door with small offerings of kindness, strangers who slowly became confidants, and though fear still visited me in the night, curling at the edges of my mind, it no longer ruled me, because every morning I woke in a space that was mine alone, and every evening I returned to a life that belonged fully to me. The final justice was not in seeing him ruined, though ruin found him in time, but in realizing that his downfall was irrelevant to my peace. I had walked away, and in doing so, I had handed him the sharpest punishment of all, a life without me, a silence that would stretch endlessly, an absence he could never replace. Justice was not shouting, not courtroom drama, not dramatic confrontation, but the simple truth that I had built something new while he drowned in the wreckage of what he had destroyed. And as I stood one evening at my window, the lights of New York glittering like stars scattered across the earth, I whispered to myself that the greatest revenge is not rage, but freedom, and freedom was finally mine. If you've listened with me all the way to the end, I just want to say thank you. It truly means more than you know. These stories come straight from the heart, and every time you leave a comment, hit that like button or subscribe, it feels like you're sitting across the table reminding me that I'm not telling these stories alone. So tell me what you felt while listening. Did it remind you of something in your own life, or did it make you see things differently? I read every single comment, and your support is the reason I can keep sharing more. So don't be shy. Leave a thought, send me a little love with a like, and if you haven't already, subscribe so we can keep walking through these journeys together.